Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Wisdom in the Best Books and Films, where we find bite-sized nuggets of truth and use them to become better people. I'm Jake Bear, the host, and we are going to continue this week with our science-y themed articles. I am going to be reading today a essay/short lecture that was given by Georges Lemaitre in, I think, 1936 or so. Georges Lemaitre was a Catholic Belgian priest. He was also a theoretical physicist and a mathematician who proposed what is now known as the Big Bang Theory, the idea that the universe began from a hot, dense state and has been expanding ever since. He was born on July 17, 1894 in Charleroi, Belgium. Lemaitre studied engineering and mathematics at the Catholic University of Louvain. His studies were interrupted by World War I, during which he served as an artillery officer in the Belgian army. After the war, he earned a doctorate in mathematics and was ordained a priest in 1923, and then he pursued advanced studies in astronomy and physics at Cambridge under Arthur Eddington and at MIT, where he received a second PhD in 1927. He spent most of his career as a professor at Louvain in Belgium. In 1927, Lemaitre published a groundbreaking paper showing that Einstein's equations of general relativity allowed for an expanding universe. He derived what is now known as the Hubble-Lemaitre law, that galaxies recede from us at speeds proportional to their distance, 2 years before Edwin Hubble's observational confirmation of that fact. Then in 1931, he took the idea further, proposing that the universe originated from a single extremely dense primeval atom, which is now called the Big Bang. He described the early universe as a display of fireworks that has just ended, with us standing on a cooled cylinder trying to recall the vanished brilliance of its origin. Lemaitre received the Franqui Prize in 1934, served as president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences from 1960 to 1966, and was widely respected for elegantly uniting general relativity, cosmology, and quantum ideas. Though cosmology was not yet Nobel Prize eligible in his time, his work laid the foundation for modern cosmology. Fellow physicist Paul Dirac praised him highly. The measure of greatness in a scientific idea is the extent to which it stimulates thought and opens up lines of new research. In these respects, we must rate Lemaitre's cosmology of the highest caliber. Lemaitre died on June 20th, 1966 in Louvain, shortly after learning of the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the key evidence supporting his theory. A man of deep faith, he believed science and religion were completely separate domains. He famously said, "I have too much respect for God to make him a hypothesis of physics," and consistently argued that the two should not be mixed. Now, I disagree with that particular thought because I think they can be mixed well, but that's okay. We're going to go on and read his lecture now. The lecture is called The Catholic Culture and the Positive Sciences by Georges Lemaitre. The pursuit of truth is the highest human activity. It is reason that separates us from animals, and our specific activity is to grasp truth under its every guise. The supernatural truth has been made accessible to us by Christ and His Church. We could never have reached it by ourselves, and it had to come down to us. The natural truth, on the contrary, is precisely proportioned to the faculties of our intellective nature. It is humanity's task to understand and value the creation that surrounds it and to which it belongs, to perceive in it a reflection of the divine intelligence by marveling at being surrounded by intelligible matter. Even if science is the highest human activity, it is not the most vital, and thus generally does not hold the foremost position it should in man's ordinary concerns. Man is also an animal, and the pressing demands of his bodily nature often absorb his activity. And man is also God's child, in whom the fulfillment of divine grace has nothing to do with the degree of his intellectual development. Scientific research remains the work of an elite exempted from the mundane concerns for daily bread. Having with much effort acquired a specialized training and capitalizing on a huge legacy, gathered by others and now used in laboratories, observatories, and so on, to achieve, within the human community, humanity's own goal, the conquest of truth. These principles are sometimes forgotten, either by exaggeration when science is put forth as the only thing that matters, or on the contrary, and because of a fairer vision of the scale of human values, when it is not granted the consideration that the scientific activity deserves. These principles govern the relations that science and religion ought to entertain, and we must examine their consequences. Many loyal people are alienated from the Church because they imagine it despises the search for natural truth, and that its teaching lacked enthusiasm for the exposition of science. It is essential that the beauty of the scientific results achieved by mathematics, physics, botany, etc., be fully brought to light. This is indeed an integral element of our school's professed humanism. In pointing out today's scientific limitations, one must carefully avoid any mistrust or contempt. The necessary criticism must be tempered by the hope for expected progress, which, as it already has, shall broaden our horizons. Theologians themselves might be partly responsible for the misunderstanding opposing science and faith. When a conflict seemingly arises between a traditional religious teaching and a new hypothesis that facts are progressively establishing, they are too prone to stall until the last moment before the hypothesis is definitely proved. They should much better cautiously study the very doctrinal points that seem to provoke conflict, and strive to discern exactly in them, under the guidance of the responsible authority, what is unquestionably asserted by revelation. At any rate, such smart courtesy would be highly appreciated by the scientific circles, and prove an excellent apologetic. Finally, and above all, we must be especially wary not to fall into the trap of second- and third-rate popularizers, who attack religion in the name of what they believe to have understood from science. These people really are agents provocateurs, who would have succeeded if we treated them as accredited representatives of science and replied by showing contempt or hostility to it. Throughout the ages, the Church has manifested its esteem for science by establishing universities and schools. An age-old institution, such as our illustrious University of Louvain, is a living testimony of the Church's past and present solicitude for scientific research. And even if some of the scientific institutions set up by the Church in the past, throughout Christendom, have become independent over the years or even hostile to it, they probably cannot forswear completely their ecclesiastical origin. The Church does not purport to a monopoly in scientific teaching. It is not uncomfortable with the same natural activity conducted in parallel. It wants to contribute loyally and according to its resources to mankind's common task. It does not matter whether the Church does everything or even much. It should only do well what it undertakes. In this matter, the Church's credit rests with the abilities of the teachers which it employs. Catholic education has to remain on par with other scientific teaching, and nothing should be spared for both the technical training of the teachers and the renewal of the teaching material, so that we remain at the forefront of every progress. No material difficulty should be used as an excuse. What one can do, we ought to be able to do well. The pride taken in what has been achieved despite difficult conditions through the admirable self-sacrifice of those who have to endure great hardships, and the awareness of the high value of our present teaching, cannot make us turn a blind eye to the advances that could make its operation less demanding and more effective. I obviously do not pretend to undertake a critical analysis of our teaching, for which I have neither the expertise nor the authority. It might not be useless, though, restricting ourselves to the serene sphere of principles, to theoretically examine what would be desirable, knowing that ideals, when applied, must adapt to many necessities. What should be the technical training of the priests on whom our school's education mainly relies? To require of them the same training as lay people teaching the same disciplines would be to oversimplify. It would amount to ignoring the 6 years of philosophical and theological studies which have given them a university-like level, even when not preparing them for any specific teaching commitment. And yet, they have to know what they should teach, or at least they must be sufficiently prepared for learning it, and in this case have the time to do so. The situation strongly depends on how far the courses to be taught are from those learnt in the seminary. However, things will always be difficult for the young teacher who must learn while he teaches. The superior will probably not wear him out prematurely under exhausting chores. His charity-inspired senior fellows will, to some extent, lighten his load. The main danger comes from the youth's keenness, which would easily lead him to abuse his strength and so quickly ruin his health. For specialized disciplines, such as physics, chemistry, or mathematics, a specific training appears indispensable. It is not even enough that the teacher knows about his course. He must also know what he's preparing his student for. This demand could be met, to some measure, if, contrarily to a widespread custom, teachers changed classes downwards instead of upwards. The second-rate Year 11 teacher might then become a first-rate Year 10 teacher, since he would know what would be expected from his students the following year. By the way, lower classes do seem to require more pedagogical experience than higher ones, and should be reserved for more experienced teachers. Conversely, primary teaching is no preparation for secondary teaching, and neither does secondary teaching prepare for teaching at the university. Finally, and above all, the teacher's role, and in particular the science teacher, is not so much to instill in the minds a few technical notions as to arouse in the students an interest in science, a regard, and even an enthusiasm for the discoveries of the human mind. And it is also to awaken in a few of them the desire to know more and to take the lead someday. That is, to no longer learn about, but to do science. But how could this happen if the teacher himself is not university trained? How could he really prepare a student to studies he didn't pursue? The ideal, which it is to be hoped will increasingly become reality, is that every teacher be either a bachelor or a doctor in his teaching field. Science must not only be taught, it must be done, and it belongs to the Church's pride that its faithful should honorably contribute to its present development. A higher education institution like our Catholic University would fail in its duties if, forgetting its illustrious traditions, it settled for teaching science done elsewhere, without contributing to the common work. Its teaching itself would soon become lifeless if it were not upheld by the dynamism of scientific research. It would miss its main goal, which is to steer the best students towards important contemporary issues, and to teach them the stern discipline of mind which shall prevent their youth eagerness from dissipating in empty quibbles or irrelevant pastimes. Research and education are complementary. Teaching prevents the researcher from retreating into his own research and compels him to enlarge his knowledge and clarify his ideas. Without personal research, the professor quickly becomes incapable of understanding and appraising other people's research, which he is supposed to assimilate and make accessible to his students. How should the Christian researcher reconcile his religious convictions to the technical demands of his chosen scientific field? It would seem, as in many other cases, that he should keep the middle ground between two extremes. One is considering these aspects as two completely disconnected compartments from which he would turn, according to circumstances, draw either his science or his faith. The other is, rashly and irreverently, mixing and confusing what must remain separate. The Christian researcher should master and astutely apply the proper technique for his problem. His means of investigation are the same as those of his unbelieving colleague. So is his freedom of mind, but only if his idea of religious truths measures up to his scientific education. He knows that all that has been made by God, but he also knows that nowhere did God take his creature's place. The omnipresent divine action is everywhere essentially hidden, It is forever out of the question to reduce the Supreme Being to the level of a scientific hypothesis. Divine revelation never taught us what we could have found out by ourselves, at least when these natural truths are not necessary to understand the supernatural truth. The Christian researcher may thus freely proceed, confident that no real conflict will crop up from his research against his faith. He may even have an edge over his unbelieving colleague. Both strive to decipher nature's multiple interlocked palimpsest, on which the traces of various eras of the world's long evolution overlap and merge. Palimpsest is an old type of paper where they would wash it off and then rewrite over it, but there was still like what was originally written on it underneath, and so it was like reusable paper basically. But the reason he uses that specific example is because it is building on the traces of what was underneath. But the believer has the advantage of knowing that the enigma has a solution, that the underlying logic is ultimately the work of an intelligent being, that therefore the problem posed by nature was posed to be solved, and that its difficulty is probably proportionate to our human abilities. Be it today or tomorrow, this knowledge might not provide him with new investigation resources, but it will help him maintain a healthy optimism, without which a sustained effort cannot long endure. In a way, the researcher leaves his faith aside in his research, not because it could hamper him, but because it has no immediate bearing on his scientific activity. Thus would a Christian walk, run, or swim no differently from an unbeliever. But the Christian researcher knows that his faith supernaturalizes both the highest and the lowest of his activities. He remains God's child when he peers through the microscope, and in his morning prayers he puts every daily activity under his Heavenly Father's protection. Reflecting on the truths of faith, he realizes that his knowledge of microbes, atoms, or stars will never help or impede him from adhering to the inaccessible light, and that, like any fellow human, he will still have to achieve the heart of a little child to enter the kingdom of heaven. Thus, faith and reason unite in human activity without improper mixing or imaginary conflict. That's the end of his little lecture there. I do like the way that he talks about faith and science working together, even though he kind of says that you shouldn't let one worry you about the other, and that's true. I guess I don't really fully disagree with that. I just think the way he says they don't mix is kind of a little bit off. Overall, though, I thought it was a pretty interesting read to learn a little bit about what Georges Lemaitre thought about some of these things. If you made it all the way through it and also thought it was interesting or enjoy the show in general, please leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share the show with friends. I appreciate everybody that helps us to get to more people. The goal of the podcast is to help people think about these things and try and figure out how we can apply them in our own lives. So I appreciate that. That is it for this week. Please come back again next week, and we will be talking about some science that was done by Henry Eyring and his book, The Faith of a Scientist. So we will see you then.